Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 15th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Joe Biden urging Northern Irish parties to return to power sharing, the Labour Party defending its controversial Rishi Sunak attack ads, and Buckingham Palace announcing that Prince Harry will be attending King Charles's coronation, whilst Meghan will not. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from Money Week, it's Digital Managing Director Guy Anker, from The Week Junior, Senior Editor Felicity Capon, and for a second consecutive week, you can't keep him down, from Daily Podcast, A Day in History with the Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. Arion, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt why Bitcoin mining really is the pits.
Texas was gasping for electricity. Winter Storm Uri had knocked out power plants across the state, leaving tens of thousands of homes in icy darkness. By the end of February 14th, 2021, nearly 40 people had died, some from the freezing cold. Meanwhile, in the husk of a one-time aluminum smelting plant an hour outside of Austin, row upon row of computers were using enough electricity to power about 6,500 homes as they raced to earn Bitcoin, the world's largest cryptocurrency.
The audio version of journalist Gabriel J. X. Dance's piece for the New York Times, released on Sunday. Arion, what's the story?
Yeah, so this was an investigation done by Gabriel Dance for the New York Times, where he exposed the really vast amounts of electricity that Bitcoin mining operations in the US are consuming annually, and the consequent massive carbon pollution that they're helping to create. And the investigation found that 34 of the largest scale Bitcoin mines in the US, and note there are many, many more Bitcoin mines than this, these were just the biggest ones, and most of them are located in Texas, by the way. But between them, these 34 are collectively using as much energy as 3 million US households, which is like the US powering another urban area the size of New York City through these Bitcoin mines alone.
And perhaps the shocking part of that, I mean, it's all pretty staggering, isn't it, if you've never got your head around Bitcoin mining before, is that I guess the general public don't really benefit from any of that electricity use, do they? It's all just for the people who own the Bitcoin mines.
Exactly, yeah. Bitcoin mines are controversial for all sorts of reasons. A lot of mining is controversial for a lot of reasons, but whereas many forms of energy-intensive industries do provide a lot of, say, employment for a lot of people, as well as generating important services, say a hospital, for example, Bitcoin mining really only does benefit the people who own that Bitcoin mine, and there's a lot of money to be made from it. So it's a really interesting moment to consider the impact not only of Bitcoin mining in the US, but also around the world as well.
Okay, well, just before we do, perhaps we'd better, for those of us who still struggle with the terms Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, define those a little bit. If only we had some sort of financial journalist on hand. Oh, Guy, what's Bitcoins? What's Bitcoin mining? Give us a 101 again, please. I know we've covered it before. It is hard to understand.
So it's very complicated. I went to a conference about 3 years ago on Bitcoin. I've got to be honest with you, a lot of it went over my head. But trying to keep it as simple as possible, Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. That means it's digital, it's in the cloud, that you don't physically hold coins or anything like that. So don't be confused by the term coin. It's all done through computers, not totally dissimilarly from online banking. In terms of what you see and looking at your balances and what have you. But what's going on behind the scenes is very complex. It's a set of maths equations to verify transactions. Very, very complicated cryptocurrency. Bitcoin mining is the process of creating new Bitcoins by solving some of these incredibly complicated maths problems in the background that verify transactions. I mean, even as I say that to you, I understand most people will probably not pick that up, but I think this mystery around the subject is, to some extent, is what makes it interesting to some people. And when a Bitcoin is successfully mined, the miner actually gets some Bitcoin themselves. That's often how they're paid.
And the fact that it's being done in the US, Felicity, and being done on quite a large scale, according to this New York Times investigation, is in itself perhaps quite surprising when you consider that it's not being done in China anymore.
Yeah, hasn't China made it illegal transactions of Bitcoin? And then you have like El Salvador, who they're a country have actually like moved to make it legal tender, haven't they? And are sort of claiming it's the reason that they haven't defaulted. So it's interesting how different countries are kind of adapting to like this new world of cryptocurrency and how it works and all the rest of it. What kind of blew my mind about, I mean, I'm a real novice when it comes to Bitcoin, but what blew my mind is that there's a finite amount of Bitcoins that can be mined, right? Which it's really hard to like get your head around of it, because when you think about mining, you think of like gold or zinc or that sort of thing, there's also going to be a finite amount. And for something man-made, that seems really counterintuitive. But my understanding is that there can only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in the world. And as of March 2023, I think I'm right in saying that over 19 million Bitcoins have already been mined. So you're getting close to the end of how many Bitcoins can be mined. And every time you mine a Bitcoin, it becomes harder to find and more energy intensive. So I think you're getting to the real like crunch point of this is getting super, super, super energy intensive. But at some point, there's going to be this like hard cap on how many Bitcoins there can be in the world. And that's also why the fact that it's so energy intensive is also inextricably linked to its value, I guess.
Yes, and that is actually a defense used by Bitcoin miners who say, yes, it's energy intensive at the moment, but because there's a finite amount of it, at some point the energy required to use this currency is going to go down because all of the Bitcoin mining, as in the discovery of the coins, will have been done. And at that point, the only interaction that's necessary from the people who used to be doing the mining will be the exchange of the currency itself. And as they say, that's going to see this massive and steady drop off in the environmental impact that they're having at the moment. There's lots of other ways that they try to defend themselves. You know, they say that they often position themselves near to renewable energy sources, for example, and therefore they are a comparatively renewable and environmentally friendly form of industry. But actually, the truth, at least as revealed by this investigation from the New York Times, is that wherever they set up, their energy needs are so great that they end up depending on old school fossil fuels, even in some cases reviving the old fossil industries that were in decline and were kind of being killed off. So lots of their arguments are a little bit thin.
That's the bit that I really struggle to get my head around, is that it seems a bit like, Guy, the providers of the old school fossil fuel energy, as Arion just depicted them, actually, they're in a symbiotic relationship with these Bitcoin mines.
Well, if you're an energy supplier, you want more energy to be used because you'll make more money. There'll be outliers that comment depending on market conditions, but more or less that's the case. So any form of production, whatever it is, that uses energy is going to make the energy firms more money. Now, I'm thinking theoretically there. Of course, we're all looking for renewable forms of energy, and I'm sure in time that the renewable sector might see this as an opportunity to work with Bitcoin miners. Can I tell you a story as well of, very much related to the question, of somebody I know who mines Bitcoin? It's not just about big corporations and factories. Individuals can mine Bitcoin, and as luck would have it, I was at their place on Friday, having an Easter egg hunt with the kids.
And did they have a shed in the garden with 10 supercomputers hooked up to the national grid, or was it a little bit more cloud-based than that?
It's really interesting, and I was speaking to my friend's husband for quite a bit on this, and at different parts of the house, they had what just looked like these space-aged hi-fi systems, the old hi-fi system, and you could feel the heat coming off them. They actually installed their own solar panels, but that's an example of an individual at least trying to do it the green way. But he actually told me that his energy bill over the winter was a lot less than he'd expected, because he just didn't need to turn the heating on. Now, if you then translate that to a big factory, you can see just how much energy it uses. And I'm just want to read you a stat here. This is from Bankrate, which is a US finance website. It would take 9 years of household equivalent electricity to mine a single Bitcoin, which is staggering, just what it actually takes, because of all these maths equations going on in the background, which none of us understand. But it's the computers and the generators just having to do so much work that, whether it's the computer, whatever you want to call it, the mining machine, it just emits so much heat.
And Guy's mate Felicity might be using solar power to power his own computers, so that is self-perpetuating. But if you're using electricity, that means that so much electricity is being used, that means that everyone's bills go up in the nearby cities. Everyone is subsidizing a few people trying to get rich by mining bitcoins through their household bills.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it does seem kind of outrageous, I guess. But if I'm playing devil's advocate, I mean, mining for anything is energy intensive, right? So whether it be gold or zinc or whatever you're mining, and that's happening all over the world at pretty astonishing rates. Does it not come back to whether you believe the commodity is worth it? I mean, I guess in the case of Bitcoin, what we're talking about is crazy energy intensive, but it kind of falls on just a subjective answer, basically. Do you think it's worthwhile mining Bitcoin in the way that we mine lots of other things, or do you not? And obviously you're going to have advocates who say that Bitcoin is really important and revolutionary technology and was set up to be a currency that's not backed by a commodity and, could revolutionize the monetary system and have, potential benefits along the way. And then there's other people who say, it's too much and it's only benefiting a few small people. So it just seems kind of subjective.
Well, it does, but that's in a way that gold doesn't, right? Because it is based on a commodity. And that's the thing, you mine gold, but then you do have a piece of gold that can go into people's engagement rings for the next 700 years. This might all just evaporate, right? In 10, 20 years, it might be worth nothing.
But the fact that, for example, the US used to have the gold standard and sterling in this country was attached to silver, and then that was kind of all unharnessed, and now you have crazy inflation and house prices are all over the place. Surely you can make a case that's why Bitcoin was set up as an alternative, right?
Also, simply by comparison with another industry that happens to offer something that is, ethereal at best. I mean, gold does obviously have a value to humans because we all prize it and we all want to wear it, but it isn't the same as, say, massively producing food that we can all eat. That has a very obvious benefit to humanity. And I think that, cryptocurrency advocates often want to make those sorts of comparisons, going, well, we only use an equivalent amount of energy as gold mining. It is, by some measures, fairly close. But I think that, you do need to consider what the purpose of it is, and you're right that there is a big sort of moral and conceptual and philosophical question around it, but also there are ways in which you can produce the same outcome without actually resting on a massive amount of energy consumption. And for example, Ethereum, one of Bitcoin's sort of competitors in the crypto space, it's the second most popular cryptocurrency in the world, and it has recently reduced its own electricity usage by over 99% in the last year by simply switching to this different method of doing its blockchain calculations. It's called proof of stake rather than proof of work. Proof of work is this massive amount of computing power that is going on with Bitcoin production. And proof of stake just rests on this whole other thing where people basically put up their own money as a sort of bond in exchange for which they're guaranteeing their interaction with the system. So it's just this whole different conceptual way of coming at the problem that means that Ethereum production is far less energy inefficient. So there are ways that Bitcoin could amend its ways. It's just that for people inside the system, a lot of them say, well, this is the safest way to do this, to keep the currency secure. And so we're just not going to switch on that basis. But I think there are big questions around this that need to be resolved.
And just as a final kick in the teeth from this article you've sent us, Arion, from the New York Times, there's detail in there about how some of these Bitcoin miners are using natural disasters to further profit from their excess energy consumption. Can you explain that?
Yeah, this did seem particularly outrageous. So basically, Bitcoin miners, like massive energy consumption, combined with their ability to shut off almost instantly, allows some of them to save money and make money through these sort of clever schemes where basically they can avoid charges during periods of peak demand and also resell their electricity at a premium when prices spike and even be paid for offering to turn off altogether. So, for example, during the winter storm Uri, some Bitcoin companies made tens of millions of dollars by reselling the electricity that they'd already bulk bought because they knew that they were going to require a certain amount of electricity in the year. And so they offered to turn off during that time and resell the energy to the grid because everyone else needed this electricity to survive the storm. And they went on, or various other Bitcoin companies have gone on to talk to their shareholders about the fact that future natural disasters like Uri could be a significant business opportunity for them. So I agree. It does seem this massive sort of extra. Yeah, it's a kick in the teeth for the people around the areas like immediately surrounding the places where these Bitcoin miners have set up. They're being punished in multiple different ways.
Okay. Guy, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is navigating today for a brighter tomorrow. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Guy, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
There's been some justice for Grenfell victims, but there's still a long way to go to right those wrongs.
Survivors and bereaved family members expected prosecution and arrests, but what they had instead was an ongoing inquiry. Now, almost 5.5 years later, the inquiry has come to an end. What that means is that the chair, the report's author, has all the evidence and he's going to assess it to see who is to blame, or rather where the blame mainly lies.
Sabah Chowdhury there reporting for Sky News on Wednesday. And as she said, Guy, in that clip, it's been nearly 6 years since the Grenfell fire, and we're still waiting for the result of the inquiry, aren't we? But this is something else.
Yeah, so what's happened most recently is that about 900 bereaved family members, survivors and residents have agreed a settlement of civil claims arising from the fire, which very sadly killed 72 people in June 2017. Now, this is separate from the long-running inquiry we just heard about, which is examining the circumstances leading up to and surrounding the blaze, and a report on that is due to be published later in the year. This is about a civil claim, settlement, compensation. The amounts haven't been disclosed. As has understandably been said by the lawyers involved, no amount of money can bring back people, loved ones, lives, horrific memories, but there will be some money for some of those victims.
I mean, it's all very well saying no amount of money can do it, but there is a difference between £1,000 and £100,000, isn't there? I mean, I'd like to know what people are getting.
Yeah, but I guess, you know, you see it when people are awarded compensation for other things, all manner of things in the courts. It's so hard, isn't it, to put value to life. It is impossible to value. Life is more important.
But they've done it. I mean, I'm just, they've done it, and yet we don't know what that amount is. I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Why is that? Why don't we know?
I don't have the answer for you for that. But this issue is obviously the chief point arising from the horrific disaster are the lives lost. But the ramifications of what happened that night in West London in 2017 are being felt by millions of people still today. Now, go back to my first point. Lives lost is the big thing, the worst thing, the horrible thing. But what's happened since is Grenfell it's like, imagine peeling an onion. This is the top layer of the onion peeled, and we saw from that the rotten nature of the way buildings have been built in the UK for decades. And I suspect this goes beyond the UK. It's just we're in the UK, so we're in the middle of it. It's exposed unsafe cladding, because it was the cladding on Grenfell Tower that spread, unfortunately, like wildfire up the tower. and that's not an exaggeration, which caused so much devastation. There is so much of that still on buildings right now. Insulation behind the cladding, so much of that is unsafe. The building industry has got so much to answer for. The regulations were horrifically bad, and I have to declare an interest. I can almost feel my blood boiling as I say this to you, because I live in a building with unsafe insulation. I'm one of the lucky ones. Ours is getting done. If we're having this conversation in about 3 weeks, you'd hear drilling, because they're actually coming to fix it all in about 3 weeks, and we don't need to pay for it because the government's picking up the bill. It'll probably get passed on to the developer in the end. But the ramifications of 3 million people around the country, around the UK, living in homes like this are incredible, because people have been hit with bills of £100,000, £200,000 to fix their cladding. If we didn't have, where I live, if we didn't have funding, we've just calculated it as residents, we'd be over £100,000 each. I don't have £100,000 to just give away.
I mean, the difficulty is, and we're seeing this in the inquiry, Guy, is that so many people were responsible for this mess that it's actually hard to point the finger at anyone. And if you're looking at your situation, I mean, there is a case, isn't there, that you, as the homeowner, should contribute, even though you had no idea that the cladding was flammable, because someone would say, well, why didn't you investigate that before you moved in? There'd be a case that the government never should have allowed it to be legal to clad a building in flammable material. There would be a case for the building company, which obviously, as you say, in this instance, are taking the rap, saying they should have never done it, even though it was legal. They knew that it was flammable, so why are they putting it on the outside of the building? I mean, who pays?
You're right to say that the list of potential people who are to blame is large. I'm, again, declaring an interest here. I don't think a leaseholder should have to pay, because regulation should be there to make buildings safe. Part of the problem was regulations for many years, and the government's admitted this. It's not necessarily the current government's fault. This goes back a long time. Regulations weren't adequate. But if I just give you the example where we live, and I won't name the developer because I'll probably be libeling them without a right of reply, but the developer clearly didn't follow the rules, because what people have done is, since it all happened, they've literally taken the cladding off, had a look what's inside. They didn't put fire breaks in between the insulation. They used insulation which was flammable, which they shouldn't have. Developers cut corners in this, and developers are paying. They're not all paying. Some of them have gone bust. Some of them are fighting it. But a lot of developers have signed contracts with the government to reimburse the costs of retrofitting buildings and fixing buildings. It's very complex because the government's putting up billions of pounds, but then there's kind of a waterfall of who then pays. If your developer agreed to pay, of course, then the developer will pick up the bill. If they haven't, depending on how profitable and big the landlord is, i.e. the freeholder, they're going to pay. But then it also comes down to the height of your building. Everything I've just said only applies to buildings over 18 metres, and people in smaller buildings are, by the way, I'm in a 20-something metre building, so we qualify, luckily. People with shorter buildings, they don't necessarily qualify. There's various pilot schemes going on. It is such a scandal because it affects so many people. You're also thinking about then the knock-on of, can I sell my home? Lots of people are trapped in their homes and can't sell. I can't sell my flat at the moment. Luckily, I don't want to. I need to wait another year or so until the building's done. But I'm one of the lucky ones because we're having it repaired and we're not paying for it. Some people don't even have a date. Some people don't have the certainty that they're not going to pay. So not only do they have that hanging over them, they can't sell it. Insurance costs are going up. Insurers are milking this. A lot of them have got a lot to answer for. There are so many layers to this rotten onion. It's unbelievable.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Guy, in a minute, because obviously you have a very personal perspective on this. I mean, from the point of view of the Grenfell residents, Felicity, or I suppose I should say the Grenfell survivors, the people who were owners or occupiers of those 129 flats who then lived, unlike the 72 people who died. For those people, this settlement, as Guy was saying, can't really go any way to restore their loved ones, but also justice for them won't even really be the result of the inquiry. Justice for them will be the third thing that's happening, which is the police investigation into all of this and someone going to prison.
Yeah, it does seem shocking in a way that so many years have gone by and no one has gone to jail. Although I was looking into this, and it ostensibly it seems like nothing's being done and it's just taking years and it's just being kicked to one side. Actually, I think the police are working extremely hard. to bring criminal charges. And I think one of the crimes would be corporate manslaughter. This would definitely seem to fit the corporate manslaughter bill. I think the problem with proving corporate manslaughter is that it's like notoriously complicated. And when you look at Grenfell, it's particularly complex. It's 72 deaths. It's 460 companies, I think, involved in various work at Grenfell over the years. The police are having to analyse over 31 million documents, 2,500 pieces of evidence, and 2,332 witness statements. But I do believe they are doing it, and I think it's a very slim silver lining that there will be charges brought and that people will go to jail.
I mean, on its most simple level, though, Arion, because it is complex and there's a lot going on, but on its most simple level, how's it possible to make cladding that's flammable? I mean, that just seems like the most basic failure of the material that you're producing.
It does. And, we're talking about the long-term problems involved in this story. And, Guy was talking about, for one thing, people like the money that lots and lots of people up and down the country are going to have to put up themselves so as to get their own buildings safer. But, for the government at least, you can imagine that it feels like it's an issue that they, as much as possible, would like not to put too much thought into. And if you look at the statistics, some of the statistics, you could think that actually it's a problem that is being solved, at least by the fact that, for example, the number of fires and fire deaths in the UK are actually at an historic low and continue to fall. So fire services attended 48,000 fires with 237 fatalities in 2020 to 2021. And that was down from 115,000 fires and 755 deaths in 1981 and 1982. And so this trend has been on a path of almost uninterrupted decline, that we're seeing less and less fires. But these figures can be misconstrued, particularly in relation to these low probability disasters like Grenfell that have hugely catastrophic consequences. And so little is being done to attend to lots of the problems that still exist around those. And so the UK government has committed around £9 billion to removing dangerous cladding from buildings similar to Grenfell that are over 18 metres in height. And they're particularly looking for this one type of cladding, which is called aluminium composite material. And so this has been found to be very, very flammable. And so they've committed to taking this off buildings. But there are these other types of material, including a thing called high pressure laminate, HPL, and also polystyrene insulation that's being used in lots and lots of buildings that really hasn't been earmarked with any sort of the same level of attention by the government for removal as well, let alone the fact that buildings under 18 metres haven't been attended to at all. There's 1.6 million individual flats in England that are between 11 and 18 metres. So those just haven't got any attention. So this statistics themselves tell you that this is a problem that has lots of different forms of solutions that haven't been even being considered by the government for any sort of repair.
I mean, there's another issue as well, isn't there, Guy, in that, I mean, Arion kept referencing the government there, but in terms of housing, the government has a pot of money, but then they give it to local councils, don't they, when it comes to social housing? So you've got the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea was responsible, technically, sort of, for the refit of Grenfell Tower, but then they themselves outsource to an arm's length body, the tenant management organisation. They then employ private contractors. And, it becomes very difficult to see whose decision something is. Is there a learning from that, as well as just like pointing the finger of blame? Should things be more straightforward?
I think the learning is have regulations that don't allow for flammable materials and follow the regulations, but that's at a very simplistic level. It is a very complex web when it comes to housing, and I've heard a saying before: you've got more rights when you buy a kettle than when you buy a property. There's often it's often difficult to know who to turn to. There aren't, ombudsmen around to necessarily go to when things go wrong, unless you say buy a new build and it's within the first 2 years you can go back to developer. Or there is an insurance scheme for new builds that only lasts 10 years, but even that's can be quite ropey. So the whole housing industry needs to look at it itself, and not just around cladding. What's actually happened in this whole debate has I think it's gone wider than that. It's gone into the fairness or unfairness of leaseholders as a principle, how managing agents act, how free who on earth is your freeholder? You know, they have a PO box, and you don't know who they are. It's a feudal system in this country. But one thing I'd say about the government, just a bit of credit where it's due. Michael Gove, the housing secretary, has actually accelerated this process of trying to get it sorted. He hasn't got there, but he's done more than anyone else in political spheres over the last few years to get this moving. And there is a lot more hope for people in buildings over 18 metres. A lot more hope.
It's also, as the story bubbles on, Felicity, people forget a bit about Grenfell, don't they? If it's not part of your daily life, because it's taken so long to resolve. I mean, yes, if you happen to live in West London, the building is still towering over everyone, but even that, of course, has a white sheath over the top of it and that green heart on the top, which has become iconic. But there's a danger, isn't there, that people have just forgotten, moved on.
I think people want to forget and they want to move on, which sounds awful. But I mean, even doing the research into this story, it is so grim. And it's so infuriating. Like, it just makes your blood boil what these people had to go through. And it just should never have happened. It shouldn't have happened X number of years ago. It certainly shouldn't have happened in a modern capital city like London, where poor people, disadvantaged people, immigrants paid with their lives for the greed and profit of other people. It makes me think of the Titanic, weirdly, that there weren't enough lifeboats. When you hear that, and it's so anguishing that they themselves were the ones saying, we know there's a problem, there's going to be a terrible disaster, and no one helped them, and there weren't fire extinguishers weren't put in, sprinkler systems weren't put in, so it was just entirely avoidable. And I just think people, it's too grim to think about.
Okay, Felicity, you're up next after this. Okay, Felicity, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered
Will the
for?
fight for justice be a shot in the dark for COVID vaccine victims?
Gemma says, I'm so sorry. I loved her radio show. She was so down to earth. Everyone said that because she was. And honestly, she was just the same off air as she was on, calm, unflappable and down to earth, like you say, Gemma. So sad to hear this from Maria. Thoughts with her friends and family. James says, such shocking and devastating news. Such great radio talent. She'll be so missed by many. Sending love to all of her family.
Listeners to BBC Radio Newcastle responding to the death of their mid-morning presenter Lisa Shaw back in 2021. Felicity, who was Lisa Shaw and what did she die from?
Lisa Shaw worked for BBC Radio Newcastle, and she died a week after having her first COVID jab in May 2021. A coroner ruled in August 2021 that the 44-year-old had died from a vaccine-induced, I'm going to get the pronunciation horribly wrong, thrombotic thrombocytopenia.
Yeah, rather you than me on that pronunciation.
Which is a rare condition linked to the vaccination.
And it was the AstraZeneca vaccine she had.
It was the AstraZeneca vaccine that she had, that's correct. And the story this week is that her husband, Gareth Eve, has said that he's been left with no alternative but to take legal action against AstraZeneca. His lawyers have sent AstraZeneca letters last November, actually, on behalf of nearly 75 claimants, several of whom had relatives die or survive with injuries that are related to the vaccine. And basically, they want some sort of acknowledgement, I think. Eve talks quite movingly, really, about the fact that he's just sort of been forgotten and discarded. He's tried getting a hold of MPs and various people, and no one really seems interested in his plight.
Why do you think that is?
It's a tricky one. I think people still find the issue of COVID and the vaccine really something very charged, sort of ideologically charged. I think if you say that, some people suffered really horrendous complications as a result of the vaccine, that's almost seen as quite a loaded statement for some people, and that you're immediately like an anti-vaxxer and you're a bit of a conspiracist nut job. And it's very hard to actually have this conversation in a calm and civilized way where we can say, factually, there were side effects and some people have suffered and will suffer their whole lives because they took this vaccine, and some people have died. I think it's something that the government and lots of people would rather sweep under the carpet, particularly because, I mean, I think people have forgotten a lot of things to do with lockdown, but the pressure to get the vaccine was immense. You know, you could lose your job, you could be prevented from going on holiday or going to pubs or bars. There was a real push to get the vaccine, and you were almost kind of like a bad, morally bad person if you didn't get the vaccine. So the idea now that we have to address the issue of the people, a very small minority, most people who had it have had no side effects, but for the very small minority, this has ruined their lives, and they are now rightfully seeking compensation.
I mean, it's possible to say both things, isn't it, Guy? It's possible to say it's awful that a few hundreds of cases ended up in blood clots. And at the same time, it probably was the right decision for the country that people en masse took the vaccine, because there were 144 million COVID vaccines given, and most people didn't die from blood clots. I mean, you can think this is a terrible tragedy, but also, had it not been given as an option to people, the tragedy from COVID deaths would have been worse. You can say both those things, can't you? Why is it so charged?
Yeah, it's like in everything. We often, as a society, and we want simple answers, yes or no. But often there are two sides to a story. You can have contrasting opinions. And I think, as Felicity mentioned, to seek answers as to what happened here doesn't make you an anti-vaxxer. It doesn't make you crazy. It's a legitimate question to ask. But, I can thinking back to when I had my jabs, I had 3 of them. I wanted one very quickly. I knew what the risks were, but there are risks with every drug. I've actually just thought, for the conversation, I've just pulled up the side effects of paracetamol. They can include blood disorders, allergic reaction, which is called rash and swelling, liver and kidney damage if you take too much. Obviously, that's if you overdose. But even blood disorders if you haven't necessarily taken too much. So even on drugs that we often don't think twice about, there is always a risk somewhere. It's obviously incredibly tragic when that risk manifests itself in a minority of cases in the sort of story we've just heard. Was it the right decision to have a vaccine program? I think it was, for the reasons you just mentioned, Olly. Is it right to ask questions when someone has died as a result of it? Absolutely, and they deserve answers.
But people's concerns about whether the AstraZeneca vaccine caused blood clots in rare cases were being expressed at the time and minimised, weren't they? I mean, President Macron expressed concerns about that when they were legislating for the vaccine in France.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, there were broad concerns across mainland Europe. Lots of countries had limitations on the extent to which they were willing to accept AstraZeneca, sometimes for various age groups, sometimes altogether. But, the UK saw the risk as being, worth the benefit. And I think that what we've seen is the real playing out of that there was consciousness that a very small number of people would be very seriously negatively affected by this vaccine, or could have been. And as it turns out, some people have had these really life-changing impacts to their health, and other people died. And I think that it is right, consequently, for us as a society to think about how we remunerate those people. And I think that that's what we're seeing playing out here. There's kind of two questions going on, because there's two ways that legal recompense is being sought. And one is via the Consumer Protection Act of 1987. That's this case of people saying that basically this was a riskier drug than what we were told about, which I suppose is what you're saying, Olly, that the risks were a bit underplayed as the vaccine and its importance was being rolled out. But the other side of this two-pronged strategy is that claimants are claiming under the Vaccine Damage Payment Scheme, which is this other scheme that was introduced in the 1970s, I believe, that was really put in place so as to reassure Britons en masse that vaccines were safe, and even if something happened to you, there would be some sort of claim that you could make to try and remunerate you for the losses that you had sustained through whatever had happened to you. The question now is whether those two different forms of protection are sufficient for people's loss. And I guess this brings us back to the question that we were considering in the last story. How do you try to put a monetary value on your health or even your life? It's impossible, but that's kind of what we're seeing playing out here.
Well, and again, whose fault is it, Felicity? It's interesting, isn't it? It's the same question, yeah, because yes, her widower is suing AstraZeneca, But I mean, you could argue, couldn't you, and I'm sure AstraZeneca's lawyers will attempt to do this, that they're a responsible pharmaceutical company that published what they knew the risks were at the time. It was the government that was telling everyone to take it, not them.
Well, I mean, that's kind of where we've got to now. What's interesting is at the start of the rollout, ministers in this country and in other countries, but not all countries, provided indemnity to vaccine suppliers. I think to get it out as quick as they could, basically. But it does sort of mean that it's put the government in a bit of a tricky position in that if you sue a big pharma or a COVID manufacturer, it's the government who will be paying. So it's expensive for the government. And the VDPS, there are lots of things wrong with the vaccine damage payment scheme, and I think that's partly why the claimants are so unhappy. But if you're successful, and you have to meet quite a high threshold to be successful, you'd get a lump sum of £120,000. I mean, for many people, that's just nowhere near enough if you have like lifelong changing in injuries or lifelong loss of earnings. That's nowhere near enough. You have to prove in this country that you're 60% disabled. I mean, how anyone proves that they're 60% disabled? And if you're 59% disabled, then you don't qualify. The claims are taking months to process. They don't have the staff looking at it. And I think what's tricky about this is that if the government doesn't sort of get its act together and speed the process up and make it more just, it will damage uptake of future vaccines. So it's not really in their interest to not get a grip on this, because you can well imagine that if there was, I mean, God forbid, another pandemic or scenario where the government wanted to vaccinate people en masse, and based off of this, you thought, oh, hang on a second, there were some really bad side effects and there wasn't really any way of seeking redress. I'm not sure I'm going to take it. It's sort of very damaging to the government's cause.
I mean, one of the blocks to this conversation happening too much these days is that people just don't want to hear about COVID anymore, as you were saying. But another thing is, I think, Guy, that it's been polarized. I mean, anti-vaxxers would say it's been polarized because the government or the BBC or whoever it is that they take aim at don't want to have a fair discussion about this and don't want to represent everyone's view. But also the anti-vaxxers have polarized it by profiting from using their hashtags and their social media channels as a dog whistle to talk about other global conspiracies and anti-government stuff, which means that you just can't, it's like you can't even mention the topic anymore without people shooting off in ways that aren't directly related to the matter at hand.
You're right. And I can remember at the time it was so divisive. I think it's a bit like Brexit versus Remain, Trump versus Clinton, and so on and so forth. It was one of these, green conspiracy versus green lobby. And often you find the same people in the same camp across those different divides. I do think, like with anything, we saw some real extremists when it came to the vaccine. As I said earlier, I'm completely separating those extremists from people who are questioning deaths as a result of the vaccine. Two different groups of people. But yes, I think the extremists have a lot to answer for in terms of turning this into other issues, as you say, and also potentially putting people off that may have otherwise wanted to take the vaccine. Third story in a row here where I actually sort of giving you a personal take. I can remember being on a plane, Belfast to London. We were sort of in that, are we in lockdown, are we not in lockdown period? And someone was thrown off the plane for not wearing a mask. And I looked them up and they were a prominent anti-vaxxer. And what was going on that plane is they were just causing trouble. The pilot, the cabin crew were doing everything right, really trying to calm the situation. They were looking to inflame it. I'm not saying there's one person is representative of everyone that was anti-vaccine, but to your point about them being some extremists, it's just an example of someone who really wanted to make a show. They put it all over social media later on, and you could find this incident.
Do you think it can be diffused, Arion?
I do, and I think that people like Gareth Eve are going to be involved in that diffusing. He has been very clear that while he thinks that he's entitled to some sort of compensation, he is not as he says, raving anti-vaxxer. And I think it's important to have that in mind, that there are going to be individual cases like these that come out of a mass vaccination program that, sadly, these are the casualties that ensure something like a campaign like this is successful. And so I think that, individuals saying I'm still in favor of the process, I just happen to have been caught up as someone who's suffered from this, it's going to be those sorts of voices that are powerful in this story.
Okay. I hope we haven't reasonabled you all to sleep. I hope you agree that was a fair-minded conversation. Don't hashtag me. My thanks to Arion, Felicity and Guy for their stories this week. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. Just tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.